Henderson, and I'm the director of the National Clearinghouse for Science, Technology, and Law, which is the National Institute of Justice Project. Today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing two people renowned for their work in forensic science, not only in their own countries, but worldwide. That's Dr. Peter Dean and Dr. Michael Baden. Dr. Dean is the coroner for Suffolk and Southeast Essex, as well as working as a forensic medical examiner for the Metropolitan Police in London. Dr. Baden is the co-director of the New York State Police Medical Legal Investigation Unit. They have both worked on cases of notoriety. Dr. Dean on the Pinochet case and other UN cases, Dr. Baden on the assassination of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the OJ case, and many others. In addition to their scientific expertise, they are both very creative and prolific writers. Dr. Dean serves as a forensic medical advisor for numerous TV shows in the UK, including Silent Witness and Waking the Dead for the BBC. Dr. Baden, many of you have probably watched on Fox TV. He's also been the subject of 9 HBO specials and is a frequent commentator on cases of high profile. He and his wife, Linda Kenny, who is a civil rights attorney, have a new book coming out, a novel called Remains Silent, which will be available August 30th. So maybe next time he comes to visit, we can have him sign that book. After the first time I met both of them for dinner, we're in Beverly Hills, and they said, would you like to go visit the creator of The Quincy Show? So what we did is we went to visit Glenn Larson, who's the producer of Quincy, Battlestar Galactica, and Magnum P.I. Now, you'll notice a slight resemblance with Peter and Higgins, if you remember, although he just shaved off his mustache, so I must tell you, when he came off the plane, I'm like, oh, you shaved off your mustache. But please join me in welcoming these experts who will discuss forensic pathology on both sides of the pond.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Carol, thank you for the kind introduction, and indeed to all of you for coming along today to join us in really a look at some aspects of the history and development of suspicious death investigation, coroners, and forensic pathology on both sides of the pond. My own background, in fact, as a coroner is probably slightly unusual in that I qualified as a dentist originally, which is not an obvious career move. One feels a little bit like a professional student, really, changing careers, but changing careers is not actually without its difficulties at times. I did once make the mistake of working in an obstetrics and gynecology department of a hospital that I previously worked in as a dental surgeon, and I think my most embarrassing moment came with a lady on the labour ward who was giving me some slightly strange looks for the morning, and when she delivered, and fortunately everything went well, she just looked at me and said, "Here, didn't you take my wisdom teeth out last year?" And my credibility as a fledgling obstetrician kind of flew out of the window, and I think she thought I was one of these people that just wander into a hospital, slip a white coat on, and start masquerading. There was another rather embarrassing moment where I was busy sewing up an episiotomy, and the midwife was chatting at the head end, and she just suddenly and rather unhelpfully stopped, looked at the mother and said, "He's a dentist, you know." And I just kind of got my head out of the way. The two knees came together very quickly. But it is always very difficult to know how one will get introduced as a coroner. One of my predecessors in Essex was asked to address a Women's Institute meeting, and anybody who's seen the movie Calendar Girls will know what Women's Institute meetings are like. And he found himself, in fact, being introduced as the man responsible for all of the unnatural death in Essex. He actually got off rather more lightly than the consultant venereologist they had on the week before, who was introduced as the man responsible for all of the sexually transmitted disease in the county. So that could have been worse, really. But we tend to think, as we look at forensic pathology on both sides of the pond, we tend to think of it, and particularly coroners, as something rather new. And it sometimes surprises people to realise that there were actually coroners way back in medieval England, and also to discover, in fact, that forensic medicine actually had its roots 2,000 years ago in ancient China. And what I thought we might do is just for a few moments leave the glorious sunshine of Florida and go back 800 years to the medieval England of the early coroners, and really have a little historical look to see how suspicious death investigation, and indeed the early coroner service, first started off. And the first possible appearance of coroners, or crowners as they used to be known, actually came from the reign of King Alfred at the end of the 9th century AD, but we have absolutely no idea of what their duties were at that time, and the official start of the office is held to be in 1194 in the reign of King Richard I, or Richard the Lionheart. And we tend to think of great good King Richard, but he was actually one of the worst rulers that England has ever had. And there had been some fairly strong competition for that particular honour over the centuries. He was an obsessive warmonger, spent less than 4 months of his 10-year reign in England, never even bothered to learn English, and on one occasion threatened to sell off London to finance his wars if he could find a rich enough buyer. And to make matters worse, having nearly bankrupted the country and the exchequer by waging the Third Crusade, in which Saladin turned out to be a really rather exceptional and underrated foe, he then had the bad luck to get himself kidnapped on the way back by Leopold of Austria. Now, at that time, the English legal system was far more involved with securing revenue for the Crown, and indeed for some of the judges themselves, than it ever was with preventing crimes. Essentially, the maintenance of law and order was seen as a duty of the men of the neighbourhood, the population as a whole. And if a crime was committed in your village, it was believed that the men of the neighbourhood had failed in their duty to prevent it, and the whole neighbourhood then was subject to a very heavy fine known as an amercement. And in fact, the most feared of these fines was a fine called the murderum, from which our word murder is derived. And the idea here really derived from really just after the Norman conquest in 1066, when there was a rather popular Anglo-Saxon habit of killing off the odd Norman soldier late at night. And to discourage this rather popular pastime, William the Conqueror brought in this murderum fine on any community where a dead body was discovered, on the grounds that it was presumed to be Norman, unless the locals could come forward and prove or present that the body was English. And in fact, as many of the early inquests started off, they were hinged on this so-called presumption of Normanry, which could only be rebutted and a fine thus avoided by the locals coming forward and presenting the body's Englishmen. So clearly the discovery of an unknown dead body in your village was seriously bad news. And there were lots of cases of bodies being thrown out to sea, and some got washed back again. You have to know your tides if you're going to do this sort of thing. And some got dragged to the next village late at night, which was even better if you didn't actually like the people in the next village, because then they got the fine. And if you were caught doing this, and many were, then an additional heavy fine was levied on your community. So essentially, sudden death started to be seen as something that was actually very important, if only as a means of raising revenue for the Crown. And there was another problem though, and I assure you this does all come to coroners very soon, but that was the very justified reputation that the sheriffs had for corruption. They constantly had their hands in the till, and in fact in 1170 there was what was called an Inquisition of the Realm, at which many of the old sheriffs were fined and dismissed. They put a new lot in, but pretty soon the new lot were back to the old ways of extortion and embezzlement. And these were the problems then that were faced by Hubert Walter, Richard I's Chancellor, when he literally had to sort out the problems of the country's finances and very literally to raise the king's ransom. And one of his ideas was to have people in every community, in every village, who were essentially elected by the people, unlike the royal appointed sheriffs who were seen as royal appointments and hated for it. And they would have a duty to keep the royal pleas. And essentially a plea was based on a breach of the king's peace and punishable by a heavy fine. And so in September of 1194, Article 20 of the General Eyre stated that in every county of the king's realm shall be appointed 3 knights and 1 clerk to keep these of the crown, or in the original Latin, custos astorum coronas, and that was the derivation of the word coroner and the official start to the office. Many of the coroners did actually get into the sheriff's old habits of extortion and embezzlement, but as they weren't paid for the job, they argued that actually improved their efficiency. The early coroners essentially worked in an environment where pretty much every aspect of medieval life had the benefit of some sort of financial revenue for the Crown. And coroners got involved with pretty much all aspects of these. They investigated wrecks at the sea, fires, both fatal and non-fatal. They investigated buried treasure, which, curiously enough, is still on the statute books in England today. So one part of our job, oddly enough, is if buried treasure is discovered in the area, we just temporarily stop our death investigation and get stuck into looking at where that came from as well. It hasn't been taken off the statute books, and in fact, Parliament passed a law a few years ago that actually increased the duties here. So basically, if it's buried, it's ours. That's the thing we have to look for. But they also got involved in taking confessions from felons and outlaws. They investigated suicides, whose goods and chattels would be confiscated to the Crown, again on the principle that they had killed themselves, and therefore this was something that the Crown could then rightfully claim their possessions as they were guilty of self-murder. And in those days, of course, suicides were denied by the Church the right to be buried in unhallowed ground, and they would usually be buried at crossroads with a stake through. And suicide, of course, was considered a crime. We still, in common parlance, talk about committing suicide, and until the 1961 Suicide Act in England, it remained a crime. I'm not sure how many successful prosecutions there were, but that's another matter really. Aiding and abetting, of course, still remains a crime. And the standard of proof that's required in coroners' courts today to return a suicide verdict remains at the higher standard of the criminal standard rather than the civil standard, which obtains with most coroners' verdicts in the courts today. But I was actually quite surprised when I was looking back through small acts of Parliament to see that in 1882, it was only in 1882, that the Coroner's Fellow to Say Interments Act finally provided that coroners should stop recommending the bodies of those who committed suicide be buried in unhallowed ground with a stake through any part of them. So old habits die hard, basically. But there is, oddly enough, some long-standing public awareness for this rather unsavoury aspect of the early coroner's inquest. And in fact, if you look at the gravedigger scene in Hamlet, it's actually a discussion between the two gravediggers about whether Ophelia, who sought her own salvation, should be allowed to be buried in hallowed ground. And in fact, one of them says at one point the Coroner had sat on her and finds it Christian burial. And in fact, what they were doing was, as they carry out this convoluted argument about whether the water came to Ophelia or Ophelia went to the water, what they were doing essentially, and what Shakespeare was doing, was lampooning the contemporary argument in 1554 into the death of the nobleman Sir James Hales, who drowned himself, and that was exactly the legal argument that was put at that inquest, which Shakespeare was sending up. And interestingly, in that particular scene, one of the gravediggers says, "But is this law?" To which the other replies, "I know. It is Crowner's quest law, Coroner's inquest law." And the scene finishes with the line from one of them, "If this had not been a gentlewoman, then she should have been buried out of Christian burial." And these early coroners also got involved in things like accidental death. And the theory here was that if you had killed something, a runaway horse and cart, fallen tree, a mill wheel, then that object's guilt could be expiated or purged by it being given to the church, given to God. And the word that was used was Deo. And in fact, what used to happen was the early coroner's jury would actually set and assess the value of the object concerned. So again, you can see a pattern emerging where, in a sense, the medieval coroner was really kind of a medieval tax gatherer. But in a sense, it was almost a forerunner of our modern health and safety legislation. And as recently as 1841, the Registrar General felt that the principle of the endowment too is full of wisdom, as it recognises the fact that accidental death may be indirectly caused, and by inflicting fines on the owners of dangerous animals, machinery, and other property, it exercises a check upon responsible parties. But there were some real oddities that these early coroners also got involved with. Bizarrely enough, they got involved in something called the investigation of royal fish. I'd say we don't do that anymore, thankfully. But it was, in those days, considered that sturgeon and, oddly enough, whales were the property of the Crown. And if a dead whale was washed up on your beach, your local medieval coroner would come along and conduct an inquest into it. I don't think they actually did slaughterings, but you know. But they also got involved, though, in a sense as being forerunners of the modern police surgeon, in that they started at that time, and this is really going back to the medieval period, they started to examine and note injuries and wounds in cases of rapes. And in an appeal from a 12th century rape, it was stated that she must go at once, and while the deed is newly done, with hue and cry to the neighbouring townships, and there show the injury done to men of good repute. The blood, her clothing stained with blood, and her torn garments. And in the same way it said, she has to go with the coroner, king's sergeant, and the sheriff. And this was refined in the next century in a statute passed in 1275, which became known as De Officio Coronatoris, dealt with the coroner's duties not only in respect of woundings and rapes, but also assault and injury in general. And that stated in 1275 that also all wounds were to be viewed length, breadth, deepness, and with what weapons and what part of the body the wound or hurt is, and who the culprit, and how many gave the wound. I think that 1275, despite the fact that this was all being conducted for financial rather than judicial purposes, there were some important, in a sense, principles of medico-legal investigation starting to form at that particular time. Curiously, the Chinese were doing these things many, many hundreds of years before. And about 30 years ago in Yunnan, in China, some bamboo slips were found in a tomb. And these dated from the Warring States period, which was about 200 years BC. And these amazingly formed part of what was essentially a crime scene investigation book for judges, and dealt with, amazingly for that time, how to identify bruises and wounds, and the basics of crime scene investigation. So whether there's a series of CSI of Beijing just around the corner, I'm really not sure. But this all got rather more refined over the next 1,000 years or so. In 1204, the Chinese introduced body sketches, not unlike the ones used by forensic physicians today. And in 1247, a classic forensic textbook was published in China. And this was a fantastic book called The Washing Away of Wrongs, written by somebody called Sun Tzu. And it actually remained on press until fairly recently. There are still copies available. And it's an incredible book. It dealt with things like the circulation of blood 300 years before Harvey was supposed to have discovered it in England. It talked about post-mortem, anti-mortem wounds. It discussed the forensic aspects of hanging. And there was one interesting case from the book dealt with a fatality from a sharp implement, a murder caused by a sharp implement. And this particular incident happened at harvest time. And all of the workers in the fields were asked to bring their scythes in, lay them down in front of them, and all of the flies buzzing around landed on one particular scythe. Dealt with them, absolutely amazing. But of course, at that time, the 13th century, back in England, the coronership had really reached a point where it then started a decline, which continued really for many centuries until a new role started to emerge in the 19th century that started to really develop a more modern look at the function of a coroner. Now, before 1836 in England, no steps at all had been taken to certify any medical cause of death, and the way in which we looked at the numbers of deaths was also rather haphazard, and consisted of 2 old women searchers appointed in each parish, and they would have the job of going out and essentially just counting the numbers of dead bodies that were lying around the place. And the system was incredibly inaccurate, and panic often ensued at times of epidemics, and these were the days of the great cholera epidemics, when they would misrecord the numbers of deaths that had occurred. Also, the system was wide open to corruption, with them being bribed by some of the families not to look at some of the dead bodies too closely, presumably to conceal some felony that had occurred. In 1833, Parliament looked at the whole issue of parochial registration, and largely as a result of panic-mongering during epidemics, the very first Births and Deaths Registration Act was enacted in England in 1836. But there were also concerns that homicides were being missed, and there were particular concerns around what were called the burial clubs that flourished at that time. And the idea here was that parents would enroll their children or other family members in one of these burial clubs, ostensibly as a means of insuring against funeral expenses if a death occurred. And regular payments were then made to a treasurer, who was usually the local publican, and what would happen is he would then reinvest the money on with the brewery or anybody else that would pay interest. And there was a particular incentive to insure children, because the club would pay out between £3 and £5 if a death occurred, yet the cost of a child's funeral in those days was no more than about 20 or 30 shillings. And as a precaution against the club not being able to settle its financial obligations, children were often reinsured with several different burial clubs. And there was one child who died in questionable circumstances in Manchester, who was found to have been insured with no less than 10 different burial clubs. So basically you had a situation where Junior was worth more dead than alive, and because insufficient attention was being paid to the medical cause of death, then guilty parents knew that they faced very little chance of detection. And these were days with extreme poverty, very large families, a recognised high infant mortality, and the uncontrolled availability of laudanum, arsenic, and numerous other poisons. And post-mortems, which had been going on the continent, certainly since the 14th century, and there's even a record of an examination conducted by a Roman physician Antistius on the body of Julius Caesar, oddly enough, in the continent had been going on for years, but in England we just weren't doing them. And this was appreciated by the Registrar General, who wrote in 1839 that it's not improbable that a certain number of cases of poisoning escape undetected by coroners and their juries, who can be expected to know little of the symptoms either of poisons or disease, and are very rarely assisted, he wrote, in their decision by the information which a careful examination of the body would furnish. He went on to say that the result of this negligence is that little is known positively of the causes of sudden death, and the facility for procuring all the more intense poisons, as well as the prospect that the effects of poisoning could be confounded with natural disease, he wrote, offers a strong temptation to the commission of that dreadful crime. And when we touch on a gentleman called Dr. Shipman, you can see that those are still current problems. So, against that background, the requirement to have more medical examination, proper post-mortem exams, was starting to develop. But from 1340, when the requirement to be a knight was abolished, until as recently as 1926, there was no legal requirement for coroners to be legally or medically qualified. In those days, you just had to be a landholder in the county, and many people got round that just by buying a burial plot in the county itself. But in 1839, London had its first medically qualified coroner, and the system then started to realise that more expertise was needed. In 1860, they looked at the fact that they really shouldn't be electing these people. They needed to be appointed based on things other than their electability. And although there were changes, it was quite a long time before there was any requirement for them to have anything other than owning land in the county. They recognised towards the latter part of the 19th century that there was a change of role here, that this was really all about investigating the cause of death for the benefit of the community, rather than looking at financial revenue for the Crown. But there were still worries about some perverse verdicts that juries were coming back with because of the lack of qualification to do the job. And in 1908, a report from government pointed out a couple of these. One verdict was the man died from a stone in the kidney, which stone he swallowed while lying on a gravel path in a state of drunkenness. Gives a curious concept of anatomy. Another verdict from a jury said a child of 3 months found dead, but no evidence to show whether born alive. Curious concepts there. So as a result of all of that, finally, a requirement was brought in that coroners had to be either legally or medically qualified. In those days, inquests were held with juries, although after 1926, the requirement to have a jury present has changed. We still sit with juries in cases of industrial accidents, deaths in custody, or indeed any time where there is a public interest in the death itself. But these days, there is a real difference in what the inquest is about. Essentially, inquests are held to really look into the causes and circumstances around deaths with the idea of trying to give answers to those who've lost, the bereaved, those who've actually been most closely affected by the death, but also to provide information for the public to try and prevent similar fatalities occurring in the future. And we have a situation essentially where, as William Gladstone wrote, we really, as he put it, show me the manner in which a community cares for the dead, and I will measure with exactness the tender sympathies of its people, their respect for the laws of their land, and their loyalty to high ideals. And as Voltaire wrote, to the living we owe respect, to the dead we owe truth. And the system as it is now in England essentially means that about a third of all deaths go through the coroner system. Post-mortems are conducted on about 3/4 of these to fully look at the cause and manner of the death itself. And about 10-12% become the subject of inquests, which are essentially public inquiries into how the death occurred. So a family member automatically has a public inquiry for which witnesses are called, questioned on oath, and essentially a story is built up as to how the death occurred to try and learn lessons from any of those deaths. We have a situation really where any unnatural death triggers an inquest. Now, there are about 130 coroners in England and Wales, and the workload varies from about 4,000 a year with a busy full-time jurisdiction to, at the other end of the spectrum, between about 0 or 2 deaths a year for the, in a sense, what was once one of the quieter jurisdictions, which was the coronership to the royal household. Because again, one of these bizarre historical things, the Queen has her own coroner. Now, usually that coroner would only get involved in investigating a death that occurred in a royal household, but we also have to inquire into deaths where the body comes back into our jurisdiction. And in fact, it'll be Michael Burgess, the coroner for the royal household, who will be conducting the full inquest into the death of Princess Diana. And essentially, we conduct these inquiries into deaths from abroad, as well as deaths arising in our own jurisdiction. And clearly, in that particular case, an enormous amount of work is still going on in looking at the cause and circumstances. I think it'll be quite an interesting inquest when that takes place. But these days, though, as I said, it's less about really looking at financial benefit of the Crown and more about an investigation, the benefit of the community into how the deaths themselves occurred. We try and provide answers for family, for any of those closely affected by the death, to prevent similar tragedies occurring. And the system, though, is going to change again, because I'm not sure how much coverage there was here of the activities of a gentleman called Dr. Shipman, but he was essentially a family doctor in Manchester. And at the beginning of 2000, he was found guilty of murdering 15 of his patients. Now, the bodies were all exhumed. It only came to light because of essentially a very clumsy forgery of a will in one case. That was the only case where there was any potential financial benefit to him. But when people looked more closely at the circumstances of Shipman's activities, it became apparent that these 15 weren't the only ones. They were all exhumed, and it was discovered that they had very high levels of morphine in the bodies. Now, what seems to have taken place is that Shipman would actually visit them at home, and for reasons which are still very much unclear and very much debated, he would then administer an injection, having persuaded them for some reason that they needed an injection, administer a lethal dose of morphine. He would write the death certificate himself, giving a natural cause of death, and was careful to write it in such a way that no suspicion would be aroused. Initially, when the coroner was first made aware of it, and our system is reactive rather than proactive, that's one of the things that the new changes will address. We can only legally react to things which are referred to us. The moment the coroner was advised of the situation, he contacted police. Police were involved, and unfortunately the first police investigation was very cursory. Didn't even pick up the fact that Dr. Shipman had a previous conviction for drug abuse. But it turned out, after several more patients died tragically, that Dr. Shipman's activities were not restricted to those 15 patients. And in fact, in the years since then, it has become apparent that Dr. Shipman killed at least 250 of
his patients over his practicing career. And because he was targeting people in an age group where natural disease was prevalent, and he was writing up the certificate, the system for death certification never actually took into account the possibility that the person writing the certificate could also be the person murdering the patient. And so we're now looking at a new system that provides those added safeguards against the unusual situation of the healthcare professional that kills. But clearly there was a huge problem there, because for years Shipman had been, for reasons rather unknown to anybody, because he refused to cooperate with any of the psychiatrists who tried to speak to him, and then finally he took his own life in prison last year. But he clearly had been conducting this campaign of just killing off patients at random for many years without even the relatives suspecting that anything was amiss. If you wrote that as a crime novel, people wouldn't believe it could happen. And the tragedy is that because he was doing it in a way that, in a sense, betrayed the trust that patients had in him, and because he was trying to get it all passed off as natural disease, it was really only very, very late in the day that his activities in Manchester were discovered. Now, clearly, it's always very difficult to actually engineer a system that prevents that sort of death occurring, where the healthcare professional is the one that kills. But we've got a situation now where that is, again, being addressed in the changes that are being made. There weren't actually many light-hearted moments in the Shipman trial, but his prosecuting counsel, Richard Henriques, at one point was, in fact, I think it was on the 6th and final day of cross-examining Dr. Shipman, he was dealing with the last death. And this was one where the patient was actually administered an injection by Shipman in the surgery. They'd established the fact that they were the only two people present in the surgery, that she was in there for about 20 minutes, and that it would have taken about 5 minutes after the administration of the morphine for the death to occur. And Richard Henriques QC said to Dr. Shipman in the witness box, "Dr. Shipman, did you see Mrs. So-and-so administer the injection to herself?" And Shipman looked back at him and said, "No." He then said, "I put it to you, Dr. Shipman, that leaves but one alternative, does it not?" And he said that was greeted by a very long silence, which I did not feel minded to break. Towards the end of this very long silence, and you can imagine the jury just sitting there looking at Shipman, his face impassive, the junior counsel sitting next to Richard Henriques just passed him a little note which said, "Ask Dr. Shipman if he'd like to phone a friend." And you just wonder how on earth he kept a straight face during the last day of that cross-examination. But Shipman was convicted, sentenced to life imprisonment, as I said, took his own life in prison last year. But there are a lot of lessons, I think, to be learned from the awful situation where healthcare professionals betray their trust and kill. Now, I'm mindful of the fact that time is marching on, and at this point I'm going to thank you again for the invitation to speak to you, for your kind attendance, and I will join you in looking forward to hearing from Dr. Michael Baden. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Peter. We divided up forensic pathology. Peter had to describe the past 5,000 years, and I'm supposed to describe current events. Thank you all for coming to this lovely restaurant where there's fine dining for everybody. It's interesting, if I may, one thing about public relations and PR and all that. As Dr. Dean said, Richard the Lionhearted was perhaps the worst king England ever had. Why do we think of him in such high tones? Because he had a good PR guy, Sir Walter Scott, who wrote this fiction that he was a friend of Robin Hood, right? So we all think that he's a great guy because of PR, and even back in the 12th century, they were spinning, as Mr. O'Reilly would say. Before I get started with current events, I do want to mention one thing. Judge Salsinas is here. His office is upstairs, I think, someplace. In 1979, I was chief medical examiner of New York City. And just before I went to meet Judge Salsinis for the first time, he was a district attorney then. And he and I were on a program at Snowmass, Colorado, for district attorneys. They go to nice places to have conferences. And just before that, I was demoted by the mayor of New York City because I wasn't, as chief medical examiner, a team player. They felt that the medical examiner should do what the DA wants. And it's very important that the medical examiner be independent. And it's interesting that Florida has one of the best medical examiner systems in the country, where all your districts have board-certified forensic pathologists involved, available, and that's kind of unusual. About half this country still has a coroner system. New York State, we have 62 counties, 50 are coroner, and 12 are medical examiner, in which a doctor is in charge. And it's kind of ironic that we still have the kind of coroner system we inherited from England in colonial days, whereas, as Dr. Dean showed, the coroner system has been upgraded many times in England in the past centuries, so that coroners are now usually physicians or lawyers, or in London both even. In New York, in the United States, coroners only have to be citizens, and they're elected, of voting age, citizens of voting age elected. And most coroners are funeral directors or undertakers. And we have 12 states that don't have a forensic pathologist in the whole state. So you people are very lucky, which will come into what's going on now with the autopsy on Terry Schiavo. But I do want to thank Judge Salsinis, because when I came to Snowmass, and I kind of was very depressed, having just been demoted from chief medical examiner, he, as district attorney and a wiser person, said to me something about, don't take it personal. If you're in the public eye, people are going to shoot at you, and it's nothing personal. It's just the fact that you have a job that some other people would like to have. And it worked. But I would like to thank Judge Salsinis, if I might. He's been around longer than me, which is hard to do. Now, how do I do this? Do I press a large button? I'm going to electrocute myself. What about this thing here? It's already, I could walk around. Now, I'm kind of new to PowerPoint. So my wife and children are trying to pull me into the modern era. As Carol said, Professor Henderson said, I've written 2 books on for popular consumption on cases I've been involved with. One for unnatural death was a stimulus for the HBO Autopsy series, which the next one will come out the first week in July. My wife, the lawyer, former prosecutor, and I have just finished a novel. Fiction is much harder, I find, than nonfiction, on, of all things, a male forensic pathologist and a female prosecutor. And this is supposed to be the first in a series, and it's going to be published August 30th, and it's 1/3 off on Amazon. Now I went too far again. Thank you. What I want to show, before we go into a couple of things, I'd like to show a little bit about how much we can learn by exhuming bodies, and as with Dr. Shipman. Now, I'm sorry this isn't very good. I try to do this from the internet, is a normal brain. I want to show you that because there are 2 things here that relate both to Pope John Paul and also to Terry Schiavo. If you can see this is the front part of the brain. It's the brain cut this way, right through. And up here would be the front of the head. This is the back of the head. This is the ventricular system, which has a normal amount of spinal fluid. The white is the skull bones, the skull bone. This is normal. Out here is the cortex. the cerebral cortex. And one of the things that the concerns about Terry Schiavo had brought up and brought to consciousness in the public is that's where all our thinking goes on. That's what makes us able to talk, to think, to be conscious. And the Pope had all that intact. He had some problems in here, which is what caused the Parkinsonism. Parkinsonism is inside the brain, but all of his cognitive functions and writing and dictating things and relating to people are out here in a thin layer here. The problem with Terry Schiavo, and this I try to get off the internet, that was one of the doctors here had done a CAT scan on Terry Schiavo. This is her bone. You can see the skull bones are different. We vary. We're born with different thicknesses of skull bone. Most importantly, we're born with different sized coronary arteries. That's one of the things you learn at the autopsy table. All people are not born equal. Those people who have bigger coronary arteries are going to live longer than those who have narrow coronary arteries in general. Those people who have thicker skulls are less likely to get fractures than those people who have thinner skulls. Now here is Terry Schiavo, and this is the front and that shows the sinuses right above the nose here. Air is black. Now here, and you can't see it too well, as one can see on the CAT scan, and this is in dispute, the outer cortex has been severely damaged. Now, way back 15 years ago, the thought about that was, the initial thought that it was due to a cardiac arrest due to low potassium while she was dieting, and at a medical malpractice trial, there was something like a $7 million judgment against the doctor who had her on the diet because he didn't recognize the potassium level going down. What's ironical and fascinating is that potassium is essential for us to live, but it's also the most rapid poison that we know. The heart is dependent on the potassium staying somewhere between 4 and 6 in our bloodstream. If it goes below 2, as here, the brain can be severely damaged because the heart stops. 25-30% of oxygen that we're breathing, 20% oxygen we're breathing in right now, which is wonderful because in New York we get less than that. So I'm on an oxygen high right now. When we breathe in oxygen, about a third of it, 25%, a third, goes to our brain. The brain is the organ that needs oxygen the most. So whenever the oxygen is cut off, like the heart stops, the brain is the first organ that's damaged, and after 5 or 10 minutes of no brain flow, then the outer cortex gets damaged. Now, if she had suffered, and at the result of the medical malpractice was they all agreed that this was a low potassium. Lethal injection, as I understand you guys do here in Florida. New York now has capital punishment. We haven't gotten to that stage yet. Lethal injection, the drug that kills you is potassium. There are 3 drugs given with lethal injection. One is a rapid-acting barbiturate to make the person sleepy. The second is succinylcholine, which paralyzes the person so they can't move. And the third is potassium. A bolus of potassium, you're dead within seconds. If you take that same amount of potassium, put it in an IV container, as is commonly done in hospitals, because whenever we're given medications for diuretics to urinate, that takes away potassium. So we're told to eat bananas, which has potassium. They give it in IVs. If you give it slowly, it saves your life. If you give it fast, you're dead. And that's also what they do in animal hospitals when they do euthanasia. Is potassium is the drug. So, if in fact Terry Schiavo did go into coma because of potassium too low, the cause of death in dehydration is just the opposite. The kidneys stop, the blood gets more concentrated, and the heart stops when the potassium gets above 7 or 8. And that's how people usually die with dehydration. Now, the question comes up, issues have been raised, could this be a homicide? Could she have been beaten up? Well, if she were beaten up, it will show today at the autopsy that one part of it has been done, and Dr. Throckmorton down in Pinellas County here is well trained and appropriately said to the media that it's going to take a while, probably take till close to June, take at least 6 weeks, I think, before they get some kind of a conclusion to the investigation. The incisions part of the examination has been done. Whatever was removed, the study was taken for toxicology to see if the morphine was too increased. And the brain analysis, which is going to be important, is going to take at least 6 weeks. Here we see on this CAT scan of her brain, the ventricle system is widened because there's been severe atrophy of the brain. Can we go back one? Let's see. I'm supposed to know how to do this. I was told how to do it. That's the previous. Okay. Thank you. My daughter would be proud of it. Now, you see here, this is the normal ventricular system. See how much tissue there is here? This is the gray matter that has all the good stuff in it, all our nerve cells in it. And this is the myelinated nerves. So we have this thickness here, but, okay. Okay, that's all right. But you see here, that's very much narrow. That's when they talk in television about a bag of water and all. It isn't water, it's cerebrospinal fluid. If you ever had a spinal tap, you'll know that that's different than water. But it fills up and you have kind of a sac. And what the neuropathologist is going to do is determine whether there are any bruises or injuries around the head. Because if she were hit on the head, if she had brain damage, if you look at an apple with a spoil spot in it, it leaves a spot on the brain. And as it heals, even 15 years later, just as if you had a cut on your skin and it heals in scars, you can see it 15 years later. Here too, if you have a brain damage and it heals, you can see it 15 years later. If she had fractured bones, which has been raised, were her ribs fractured, her pelvis, her leg bones fractured, when the bones heal after we're adults, as a baby, if you get a fracture, if you're 10 years old, it can reorganize itself. But after we're 20 years of age, we get a fracture. The scar, the healing of that fracture will show even 15 years later. So the autopsy is going to be very important and very helpful in the findings in determining whether she had suffered any kind of abuse. If she had abuse, then the police would have to be informed, they have to investigate it. Now, because we can't tell if a fractured skull is caused by a blow, caused by being pushed or by falling accidentally, for example. That's the police investigation. One of the advantages that the medical examiner has over all of us is that whenever we have a case that comes into investigation, the medical examiner has the ability to get all the back medical records. So certainly here, the medical examiner evaluating the admission records of Terry 15 years ago to the hospital, of the EMS, emergency medical services stuff is terrific because they save that stuff. And when the ambulance was called, what did they find? What did she look like? What was the circumstances like? He'll be able to look at the x-rays taken 15 years ago. Were there fractures or were there not fractures? If there weren't fractures 15 years ago and there are fractures now, that's a clue that maybe it happened while she was in the facility or something. So all of this will be, and it sounds like, that he's gotten involved, a board-certified forensic neuropathologist, that is, We don't have dentists doing OBGYN deliveries in this country, because if a dentist did a delivery and something went wrong, the insurance company would be out a lot of money. but a neuropathologist is a pathologist who specializes in brain analysis and spinal cord. One last point on that. It's interesting that once the brain is damaged, once the neurons of the brain is damaged, they don't regenerate. The liver regenerates, the kidneys a little bit regenerates, but the brain doesn't. So whether it's Richard Reeves, who has a spinal cord injury, or Terry Chavo, who has injury to the brain, right now, and this will be determined also by the pathologist, if there aren't enough neuron cells to improve, nothing can help, except that's where the issue of stem cells comes in. Will stem cells create new neurons that can make people who are quadriplegic walk? Will neurons be able to repopulate the brain? And one of the things the neuropathologist will do will be to count the neurons and to see which areas could have improved and which area functions couldn't have. And that should all be clarified much more than we have now in about 2 months. Now, what am I doing? Okay. Now we get to the Pope. That's also current. And one of the issues that come up is, do popes get autopsied? Do they get cremated? Well, Pope John Paul II has already been embalmed. Interesting about embalming. See, if he's going to lay there for many days, it's important to embalm. They had a very bad episode with Pius XII. When he died back in 78, I think 1978, there was his physician, I think it was a dentist actually, in Rome, arranged for the embalming and did a lousy job so that he deteriorated very quickly, and the Swiss guards complained that they could, people could smell the odors and all. So 33 days later, when John Paul I dies, remember he died very quickly, there was a rapid embalming to make sure he doesn't deteriorate, and then people afterwards came out to say, well, the reason they did a rapid embalming is because he was really poisoned by people who didn't like that he was too liberal or something. And there's still an issue. Some people think that John Paul I was poisoned because he died so quickly after coming into office. So right now, the issue of embalming really started in this country as a legitimate thing when President Lincoln died. And of course, it was done initially in the Civil War to have soldiers being shipped up from hot South to New York to Northeast states. But when Lincoln was embalmed, it created the whole embalming industry here, because he was going to be on a train and was going to be shown for about 10 days or 2 weeks or so. And whether you're shown for a few days or a few weeks, you have to be embalmed so you don't deteriorate. Now, just going through, in 897, I'm poaching on Peter's territory, Pope Formosus was exhumed. So a pope was exhumed because his successors thought that he was a bad guy and had him tried. They took the body, dressed it up, and found that he was guilty of doing bad things as a pope. 1410, Alexander V was autopsied when he died because there was concern that he had been poisoned. Now, in 1410, they didn't know much about poisons, because even if they were poisoned, they couldn't identify a poison. But it's just interesting that in 1410, an autopsy was done. Popes are not usually autopsied. The first, this is for Carol Henderson, so the first autopsy in this country is, for coroner's jury verdict, was in Maryland in 1657. Now, one of the issues that has come up with autopsies has been whether or not the popes are autopsy. Generally not. There was an issue here that the Polish people would like have a tradition of taking the heart of their heroes and putting in this special church that they have. And if in fact the Pope's heart was removed and given to Poland, it would have been before he was embalmed, which was within probably 24 hours of his death. Now, a couple of things that I just want to touch on with Dr. Shipman. We have doctors and nurses in this country who kill lots of people. So there was, and Dr. Reeves, who was down here, had made a point that he thought some of the people in nursing homes were being given too much morphine to die because after they had used up all of their insurance, people who are in a comatose state. And these are issues that are going to be addressed and come up as people live longer. Here, just to show you what exhumation looks like. Medgar Evers was a civil rights leader in the United States, Peter, in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963 when they had the marches of people from North going down to educate people in the South. And he was shot and assassinated a few months before John F. Kennedy in Jackson, Mississippi. Here he is being buried with his children in Arlington Cemetery. This is Medgar Evers. He was 33. And 28 years later, after the governor's papers were opened up, that is, after 25 years, the governor's papers are opened up. This was gone over in a movie, Ghost of Mississippi, recently. Mrs. Evers saw that there had been jury tampering, that while the Attorney General was prosecuting, or the district attorney, actually in Jackson, Mississippi, was prosecuting the guy whose rifle was found at the scene with his fingerprints on it for the murder of Byron Del Beckwith, the head of the white supremacist group. The governor's office was giving information as to potential jurors to the prosecution, which the defense, which the prosecution didn't know about. And because of the jury tampering, it was reopened for another trial. They had lost the autopsy report, so they asked if we could. I spoke about this with the district attorney. You never ask a barber if you need a haircut. You never ask a medical examiner if you need an exhumation. We can always learn something from an exhumation. We exhumed the body. This is the body from Arlington Cemetery. It had on it, on the box that it was put into and then driven up to New York State Police in Albany where he did the autopsy, that it was from Memphis, Tennessee, that this had been made in Memphis, Tennessee. So the personnel at the hospital thought that, the secret exhumation, it must be Elvis Presley. And there were stories in the newspapers about how we were exhuming Elvis Presley, which garnered all kinds of publicity. And it turned out we would. Now remember, 28 years after, when people were asked about it, other medical examiners say, you're not going to learn anything from this because there won't be anything left. I've always found at least you have bones left, and bones can tell you something if somebody's been shot, because often bones are injured. And here, when we opened up the casket, he was in perfect condition, like he died a couple of days ago. And here's his son, the little guy that you saw in the early picture, and the district attorney, who's now a judge in Jackson, Mississippi, looking at his dad. He had no memory of his dad. He's now the same age, 32, as his dad was when his dad was shot. And here is Medgar Evers, and with his Masonic stuff. And this is, remember, 28 years later. Now, most people don't last this long. What causes deterioration of the body is water, usually rainwater and all. But also the embalming is important because that preserves the body. When I went down to testify at the trial, I sought out where the funeral parlor was that prepared the body. And sure enough, there was a guy there who was an old-timer who remembered Medgar Evers. This is 30 years later when I got down to the trial. I asked him, is there anything you did different then that you do now because the body is in such good condition? And he said, yeah, back in 1963, we didn't have air conditioning and we didn't have refrigeration for the bodies. So when we had a body that people were going to come from distances and we had to hold the body for a number of days, as with Medgar Evers, he was a hero of the day, we used 3 times as much embalming fluid. And that's, I think, enough. That's enough to kill all the bugs and to keep them in good shape. Also, the other thing is, notice that the inside is the casket is dry. When we went back to Arlington Cemetery, they're running out of room there. So if there's a family that has a plot, a soldier and his family, they dig down 12 feet instead of 6 feet. So he was 12 feet underground when he was exhumed, and it was very dry. No water had gotten in. That's Medgar Evers. This is what an autopsy looks like. This is the first commemoration. It was autopsy, 1963. We did a second autopsy, and the second incision is from the top of the head, just 2 incisions, Y shape, and back of the head to look at the brain. And this is a bullet track that entered the back and came out the front. So we were able to reconstruct the autopsy findings. There were some little fragments on that x-ray that just went by of the bullet that we removed. His teeth, we always identify people. We were able to identify Medgar Evers from his teeth and from his fingerprints. Still at 28 years, the fingerprints were good. This is Martin Luther King being stopped by Secret Service people when he was going to pay his respect to Medgar Evers. And after, this is me when I was thinner, showing the x-ray to the jury. And this is Byron Della Beckwith, who was charged with the murder. And there were 2 trials, and both hung juries. It's amazing that there was even a hung jury in Jackson, Mississippi in 1963, 1964, especially when the jurors were picked by the defense with secret information from the governor's office as to having affiliations with the Ku Klux Klan and other anti-black organizations. And he was 30 years later, Byron Della Beckwith was convicted, and he died about 3 years ago of natural causes in jail, having exhausted all his appeals. We said, hey, there's too long a period of time, that because of the 28, it took 30 years to bring him to trial. There were all kinds of legal issues that came up about too long a wait or something, witnesses lose their memory and stuff like that, and all that was denied. So he stayed in court. The last thing I want to mention is some current forensic science. What do we do now? In the old days, we'd exhume a body to find things like gunshot wounds and all, and poisons. But now technology has gotten so good that here we take little bits and pieces of tissue, put them in formaldehyde, then make wax blocks and make microscopic slides, the things that you look at in biology class under the microscope. Those blocks of tissue, even the slides, have enough information now that the lab can do DNA to see if there's identification of the decedent, and toxicology. So if you have old cases and there's some suspicion about things, even the body's been cremated, you can go back to the stock bottles, which are kept for decades sometimes, go back to the wax slides, and these little pieces of tissues that are taken at autopsy and put into formaldehyde, and they have DNA and they have toxicology. And the last point I'd like to make is how important something like hair has become. I can't afford to do this much. Neither can the judge. But a single hair now, at the root of the hair, you can get nuclear DNA, which is DNA from the mom and pop. And that's a double helix that we'll talk about. But the rest, the shaft, is loaded with mitochondrial DNA. That's the DNA we get only from our moms. We get it for just our mothers. So that's helpful in identification of bodies that are found, as Peter said, that are unidentified. In New York, the coroners had a better scheme. New York was the first coroner's office in the United States to change to a medical examiner's office in 1918, in which the person in charge had to be a physician and a pathologist, a physician and a pathologist. And the basis for that part was the coroners in New York, in Manhattan, and other boroughs would fight over bodies because they got paid per body. So they would, if they found the body here, it's changed. They found it under a body, and they issued a death certificate, they got $25. If they found an unknown body, especially in the water, they'd issue a death certificate, John Doe, drowning, go away, and his assistant would then kick it back in the water. And they'd pull it up another day or two and make out another death certificate, and each one they get paid for. And it's because of scandals like that the medical examiner system was set up in New York City. Now, also, one of the wonderful things about the hair is it becomes a warehouse for most drugs that we take. When we take a drug, it gets into our hair. It gets into all our tissues. And then it goes out of our tissues, the liver, the other tissues. But the hair keeps growing, so it outgrows the blood supply, so molecules of hair get caught. So we've got murder cases, poisoning solved by this way, where the head hair grows about a centimeter, almost half an inch a month. So we can tell, say, from a single use of something even like date rape drugs that we have, the benzodiazepine roofies. What happens, somebody gets a drug, and the date rape drugs, by the time the woman remembers what happened, it may be 18 hours or something like that, and it's all out of the system. But it's in the hair. And we can find, look at this wonderful stuff here. The hair, we can tell with Professor Henderson, that goes out about 18 inches. That's 36 centimeters, say. We can go back 3 years and at the tip find out what she had for breakfast 36 months ago. And we all focus in on DNA, but the toxicologists have also advanced tremendously. So we're able to tell an awful lot, not only whether a drug is present, the only one we can't find really is alcohol, because that gets washed out, and when it was taken, and whether it was taken once or multiple times. Because by doing segmental analysis, every centimeter, one can tell how much of the drug was given, and that's what was, people get poisoned at home. We had a thallium poisoning case, we had arsenic poisoning, and you can pick it up in the hair very easily. So, let's see, the last slide, I'll bring you into the, that's Shipman. Can we go back one? Let's see. Now that's in a, also I just want, baby, let's see. I'm almost finished. That's Shipman, a physician killed, we had it up to over 300 people, maybe. Hello. What I want to say is there's one slide there from yesterday's New York Times to show you how good I am. And I did it myself, and you'll see. How do you have such fine... Do it the wrong way. Yeah, can we go back to that blue slide that doesn't... One thing, though, that police have to remember. This is from the New York Times yesterday. Thank you. 9/11. 2,700 people died. There's now a determination that 50% of the victims have been identified using all technologies, most of it fingerprints and dental, a small number by DNA, and 42%, 1,200, have not been identified. The reason they haven't, by the lab, that did all kinds of $80 million worth of testing and all, and the reason is, and for all you out there, the lab can only work on what it gets. If you don't give the lab the right stuff, no matter what miracles it can perform, it can't do that. And what happened here was with all the commotion, no forensic pathologist went to the scene and collected body parts. They were collected later on after they were deteriorated. And the firemen were the ones who were collecting the body parts, and they were collecting firemen by the uniforms. So I think that the important lesson to be learned, whatever the current Mayor Giuliani felt it was more important to get the bodies out, to get everything out, all the debris, than to wait and sort through it, is that you're not going to identify somebody if the lab doesn't get the right material, even though they can do miracles with DNA, with toxicology. And with that, thank you all very much. Carol. Thank you.
I'd like to thank both Dr. Baden and Dr. Dean, and we do have some minutes if any of you have any questions for either of them.
Come on.
Any questions at all?
Yeah. There must be a question out there for Dr. Dean is going back over the pond tomorrow. So, what's the lowdown about Princess Diane?
That's the $64,000 question, I think. That still is to be decided at the inquest itself. What's interesting is that certainly Mohammed al-Fayed, the father of Dodi al-Fayed, is still convinced that there was a conspiracy at work. Michael Burgess, the Queen's Coroner, I think made a very sensible decision in asking the ex-commissioner of the Metropolitan Police to reinvestigate the whole case. And in fact, Sir John Stevens has been conducting a very thorough investigation. He's a guy who's respected, Sir John Stevens, and I think that whatever conclusions the inquest finally does come back with, I think it will have the weight of his authority behind it. But it's a story that's still very much evolving, and we, I think, wait to hear what the outcome will be. I probably won't say anything more about it than that at the present time, as it's still very much a case which is yet to be heard in full in the coroner's court. But we will, I think, watch this space with interest.
Like Terry Schiavo's, I was interested in the accusations of broken bones. And I was wondering, her being in that contracted position that she's been in for so long, and nursing home workers working with her to turn her body and keep her clean and things like that, couldn't fractures occur naturally that way?
Well, certain fractures can occur, and with CPR and other things, rib fractures, it's unlikely. What's been claimed in the media is that some doctors have looked at the bone scan and saw fractures of the pelvis and the legs and the ribs. Those are unlikely to be caused by turning. Now, bone scans are not good means of identifying fractures. It gives a clue. Regular x-rays are important. It doesn't appear that those were taken. But when Dr. Throckmorton finishes the examination, he will be able to determine if there are any old fractures that are healed. And then he will compare it to, did she have them when she came into the hospital 15 years ago? And we'll have to investigate as to how it could have happened. But yes, people who are bed rest, who lose calcium, who have osteoporosis, they're not supposed to have fractures when they're turned, but sometimes it's done carelessly. But one thing about Terry Schiavo, from what I gathered, she had no bed sores, her skin was good, she didn't have pneumonias, which is usually why people in coma of all kinds die, because of bed sores and infections. So she was given very good care for 15 years. In that regard. But the issue of whether or not she suffered fractures or brain damage due to trauma should be resolvable by when the autopsy examinations are completed.
On the autopsy to Schiavo, did you comment on whether or not the autopsy of the brain would reveal a level of consciousness or the absence of consciousness?
Well, the autopsy will be able to identify how much intact nerve cells there were. Now, if nerves, each part of our brain does a different function. Consciousness depends on the outside of the cortex. If the finding is that all those nerves have been damaged and are gone, then she couldn't be conscious. If she has some left, then there'll be an interpretation. But that's why there are treating doctors. The medical examiner will be able to go and review all the medical records. What did the doctors at the hospital on admission 15 years ago in the hospice and although what did they find? They're the best ones able to evaluate function. And the autopsy findings can say it's consistent or not consistent with those diagnoses.